We're talking about the impact on gold from the election outcome in the U.S. Joining me today is Neil Meader, Director of Gold and Silver at Metals Focus. Neil, welcome to Kitco.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
In your recent research, you discussed how the election may not have a material impact on gold in the long term. Can you discuss that further?
Absolutely. Well, I think there was some initial expectations that if we'd seen the so-called blue wave, that there would have been a much more expansive fiscal program coming through from the US. And that was implicitly seen as inflationary, which would have been pro-gold. But now that we have seemingly still to have a Republican-controlled Senate, we may not see that same fiscal push come through. And I think that has led to some cooling of enthusiasm on that score. But we have to bear in mind that we're still going to have a very generous fiscal position. And on top of that, all indications are we're going to have a very easy monetary regime. I mean, real rates staying low for a year and a half or whatever. So no pressure coming through on that score whatsoever. So it's a really nice backdrop for continued interest from the institutional investor.
Right. Now, you mentioned monetary stimulus. Would that be enough to drive inflation, even in the absence of a large fiscal stimulus bill?
I think there's always an ongoing concern that the unprecedented or emergency monetary regime that we have in the US and globally will ultimately feed through to higher levels of inflation. I mean, we can't ignore the fact that what we're seeing is very unusual, and classically trained economist would think that this should ultimately follow through with strongly rising prices. Now, that didn't happen back in the past or after the GFC, but if you're then looking at what's happened to US monetary supply, we didn't actually see that much of a lift because of a curtailment in lending elsewhere. But if you're looking at monetary supply now, that is much higher than back then. So I think there are good grounds for people believing that inflation could come through. And to an extent, even if it doesn't, people might buy gold because fearing it could do.
Right. What about the US dollar? It's another important driver of the gold price. Where do you see the dollar headed?
And it certainly has been important historically. It seems to have been somewhat sidelined in the last year or so. There's been much more of a focus on real yields, much stronger correlation there than with the dollar. And you can quite often see times when you'll see dollar being positively correlated with gold. I mean, if people are piling into the dollar as a safe haven, then that kind of messes with gold as its traditional safe haven role.
Do you see a rush to safe haven assets in 2021, given that, as you discussed, the election outcome has come in?
I think that's a great question. I think if we see the realization that any form of economic recovery, a true one globally, is going to be a drawn-out process, and that, yes, we've had a couple of vaccines come through, but you could still see some uncomfortable situations, and not all governments will be able to provide the same level of fiscal support to their economies that they have done so. And ultimately that has to end, and it's very difficult really to see how monetary policy can get any easier. Throw in then some trade tensions or whatever, and yes, there's clear scope for people to be seeking safe havens against that background.
We talked about gold a lot as a monetary asset. Do you consider gold at all as an industrial asset? Could it have an industrial component in the future?
I don't think that the industrial side's ever really going to grow to make a material difference. I think what we should keep an eye on, though, from the fundamental side, or certainly one that's been attracting interest of late, is what the official sector has been doing, i.e., central banks, that they swung from quite sizable net buyers in the last few years to actually net sellers in Q3. And that, I think, has certainly caught the attention of some in the markets. And I think that's the sort of headline on the fundamental side that's of most interest.
What about silver now, Neil? Do you like silver as well?
Absolutely. I think silver is going to fulfill its traditional role of being a more highly geared version of gold. So all those pro-gold stories that we've been thinking of will apply in spades to silver. The interesting thing with silver is, of course, as you know, it's 50% or whatever industrial metal. And so it has been hampered by a weakened industrial base because of COVID. But of course, in 2021, you're almost guaranteed that you see a lift as conditions start to normalize. So that industrial handbrake, as it were, really should get lifted next year.
It's almost interesting that you brought that up. I find it fascinating, the dichotomy between the industrial demand and the monetary demand. If silver has an industrial component that, as you said, is forecasted to improve next year, wouldn't that naturally mean the economy is improving and that there's less of a need for gold and silver as safe haven assets? Going back a little bit to the previous question we talked about.
Sure. Well, I think there is scope for both. That if you're looking at an unstable financial market, that can coexist with an improving economy. But that's just because 2020 was so goddamn awful. If you're looking at 2021 in comparison to 2019, then the comparisons start to look a whole lot less comfortable. And whatever happens with the real economy in 2021, even if it is improving, governments are still going to be in a worse financial fiscal position, and we could have that potential for inflation to start rearing its head.
Neil, do you have an outlook for the price of gold and silver in the next year?
Sure. Well, we're expecting gold to, by Q3, we should be seeing a period average, maybe Q4, something like 2,100. So we'll be looking at daily highs. Should get into sort of 2,300, maybe even nudge 2,4 if things are looking exciting. Silver should slightly outpace that in percentage terms. So you'd be looking at daily highs, mid to low 30s, something like that. So plenty of scope to improve on where we are. Important thing, though, between the two, gold on looking as if we could see record highs, silver still well off the records that we saw earlier.
Neil, I want to thank you so much for your time today.
No, my pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for watching Kitco News. Stay tuned for more IPMI coverage.